simulations than the one that was presented before, and it's putting it in context of what we've done in Louisiana. Next slide. Okay, so as I did before, I need to give an introduction to the model itself and talk about some of the strategies that we use for simulations. I mean, one thing we realized early on is that in some cases there's a tremendous amount of culch, and might it be possible to allow harvesting beyond a no-net culch loss? So essentially the strategy for simulations, the initial strategy for simulations, and the definition of sustainability is no net culch loss. But I'll talk about some simulations that at high levels of culch allow some loss of culch. And then, as I talked about before, I'll talk about how we think the system works and some of the positive and negative feedbacks to sustainability. And then I'll talk a little bit about where we're going with all of this. Next slide. Okay, so the shell budget model was initially developed for the Louisiana oyster fishery. It was funded by Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries for about 8 years. And as we go through this, you may want to think about how you do your stock assessment so that it's amenable for shell budget modeling. And so the Louisiana stock assessment provides numbers on oyster density, and the oyster, we have the size, oyster numbers by size, culch density, and then of course very important is simply the reef area. And so these are the inputs into the model, and the model simulates growth, natural fishing mortality, and culch loss or gain. And so as oysters die, they're in place, they're added to the reef, and as the shells are fished, those shells are debited from the reef. We've developed equations on growth and mortality that are size and time dependent. And growth and mortality, the equations for growth and mortality are also now linked to specific values of salinity and temperature. In the fishing can occur for seed oysters and or sack oysters. And fishing rate is time dependent. The user inputs the expected scenario for fishing, which I will show you. And the sustainability criteria is the no net loss of culch. Next slide. Okay, so we've done this for Louisiana, and Louisiana is divided into 7 coastal study areas, from coastal study area 1 in the east to coastal study area 7 in the west. And essentially these are watersheds which are reasonable management units. Next slide. And so what we've experienced in Louisiana, and I think this has occurred in many other places, that there's been a tremendous decrease in the number of oysters available since about the year 2000. And this is for the public oyster grounds only. We're still getting production from private leases. So what I'm talking about here today applies only to the public oyster grounds. Next slide. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to determine what the fishing season is, and then you have to distribute the sack and seed fishing across time. And so in the first case for CSA1, we're fishing for both sack and seed, and across the rows have to add up to 100%. So this first case is saying that there's sack fishing from November to February, and the expected effort is about the same over that time. The seed fishing for CSA1 occurs only in November. And likewise, this is set up for all of the coastal study areas. Next slide. And then you have to proportion the amount of seed fishing relative to sack fishing. So in CSA1, it would be expected that most of the fishing effort would be applied to the sack fisheries, only about 10% applied to the seed fishery. Next slide. So the new equations we've developed for growth and mortality are temperature and salinity dependent. Now, temperature is fairly predictable, and we need only one scenario for temperature. This is what it is, as you can see on the slide, and it comes from central coastal Louisiana. Next slide. Now, salinity is much more unpredictable. So what we've done is we've developed scenarios for low salinity, moderate salinity, and high salinity. And this is done by month because calculations of growth and mortality are made on a monthly basis. So we have a low salinity scenario, which is a little less than 9 parts per thousand as an annual mean, a moderate salinity scenario, which is a little less than 15, and a high salinity scenario, which is about 21 parts per thousand. This was based on the oyster fishing zones in Louisiana from a publication by Melanson et al. Next slide. And so this is some of the results of the simulation. So we have the reef and what coastal study area it is, the oyster density, the initial oyster density, O sub A, the initial culch density, a description of the simulation result, and then O sub B is the final oyster density, that is after the simulation. C sub B is the final culch density. HSE is the seed harvest. HSA is the sack harvest, and these are in terms of Louisiana sacks. And then S refers to the salinity scenario. So I just picked out a few examples. So at 3 Mile reef, there's less than 1 oyster per square meter, and it's just not fishable under any salinity scenario. There just aren't enough oysters there to support the amount of culch needed. So you even though there's only a small amount of culch and it's suboptimal, there aren't even enough oysters to support this small amount of culch. So this is an example of a reef that is not fishable. And when we do the simulations, the first simulation we do is with no fishing. And so if with no fishing, there is no sustainable harvest, then it's considered not fishable. Okay, then we go to Shell Point. It has about 6.6 oysters per square meter. It has quite a bit of culch, about more than 5,000 grams per square meter. And here the status is solved. Okay, so the criteria is no net loss of shell. And so it goes through the entire simulation, and the simulation is solved such that the initial culch and the final culch is essentially the same. And given under the harvest is the different number of sacks, the number of sacks under low, moderate, and high conditions. So this is not a large amount of harvest. When you only have about 7 oysters per square meter, you're not going to get much of a harvest. Then we go to Chenier Reef, which is in CSA 7. In CSA 7, there is no fishing for seed. So the oyster abundance is much better, about 17 per square meter. There's a good amount of culch. So with the conditions that are applied to the scenario, namely the fishing conditions, the model doesn't go all the way to sustainable criteria. So if you look at this case, C sub A is about 4,100 grams per centimeter per meter, and C sub B is about 4,500 grams per meter. So in this case, with the conditions that we put on the simulation, in terms of the fishing scenario, there is actually a net gain of culch. And even in these situations, the amount of harvest here in the case of sac only is really not all that high, but much better in some of the other cases. And notice here that under the high salinity conditions, in which there'd be a lot more mortality, there is much less harvest. Next slide. Okay, so then sustainable fishing essentially is the sum of the results across the different coastal study areas. So we have coastal study area from 1 to 7. We have the harvest of seed, the harvest of sac, and then the salinity scenario. So you get 3 different estimates based on salinity scenario. So the idea here is that you can't predict salinity, but you might make a guess as to whether you're having a low, moderate, or high salinity, and you could use those numbers to determine what quota you might want to use in fishing. So I've just highlighted the fact that for seed oysters, under the low salinity assumption, under the low salinity assumption, you have the greatest harvest of seed, and for sac oysters under the moderate salinity scenario, you have the greatest harvest. Next slide. Okay, I showed this slide before, and it's what we're trying to do is summarize what we think is happening, and we're talking about this in terms of positive and negative feedbacks to sustainability of the reef. So we'll start with we'll start on the left where you see the negative sign, and just look at coach. So we'll start there. And so this is a situation where there is a suboptimal amount of coach. And so with a suboptimal amount of coach, you're going to have diminished spat set. And we're also claiming or believe that you will likely have diminished, you would have enhanced juvenile mortality. And we think that because of the more coach, the more spatial heterogeneity, the more nooks and crannies for the oyster spat to survive, the more boxes, the higher the juvenile survivability. So you would have enhanced juvenile mortality with a poor culture condition. And so you're not going to have this adequate recruitment. You'll have a depleted adult stock. And with a depleted adult stock, you'll have diminished spawning, and you don't have enough adult oysters to grow up to a size to resupply the culch. So you get into this negative cycle: poor culch, high juvenile mortality, low spat set, few oysters dying to maintain the culch. So you have to break out of this cycle, and you can culch. And so I'm looking at the middle here, and the arrow going from left to right. So one way to get out of this cycle is a time-honored method of planting culch. But of course, you have to get recruitment for this to work. So now we're looking at culch on the right-hand side where the positive sign is. So you're enhancing culch. So we have more culch now, and this enhances the spat set. It results in early survival of oysters so that they grow to an adult size to enhance the adult stock. More adults mean increased spawning. More adults mean there's the potential for more adults to die in place, in which the culch is enhanced. Okay, so you can go from the positive to the negative. So now we're looking at the arrow, which is going from right to left. So with natural culch loss and fishing, which removes adult oysters, in particular overfishing, can result in poor culch, which brings us back into the negative cycle. Okay, next slide. Okay, and I showed this slide last time as well. And this was from a 2016 survey where I just looked at the data and asked the question, under what conditions do we get good harvest on Louisiana reefs? And good harvest here, I'm not talking about hundreds of sacks or even a few thousand sacks, but tens of thousands of sacks. So I just looked at the data and looked at where high harvest is coming from. And this is how it fell out. And I looked at it in relationship to the number of oysters per square meter first, and the amount of culch. And so I then divided all of the reefs into one of these four quadrants. And there were only 9 reefs representing about 1,300 acres, which had good culch, more than 1,000 grams per square meter, and relatively high oyster populations, about 25 oysters per square meter. There were 38 reefs with a much higher acreage that had pretty good culch, but didn't have high populations of oysters. And by far the greatest number of reefs, the greatest number of acreages, the greatest acreage were places that had neither good culch nor good populations of oysters. And there were no examples of having a lot of oysters on poor culch. Okay, next slide. Yeah, next slide.
Can you see the future direction slide, Tom?
No, but I'm almost, yeah, okay. So, you know, where are we going with all of this? Well, our criteria is no net loss of culch, but we do want to have standards of culch, the amount of culch, and determine what the optimal population of oysters is. So those are going to be criteria that are developed in this SK project that we're currently working on with our state agency partners and industry partners. And the ultimate goal is the Gulf-wide application of shell budget modeling. So I'll open it up for questions. I might have trouble hearing people, and I might have to have Katie repeat the questions, but I'll open it up for questions.
Hi, Tom. This is Laura Gesselbrock. I have a question. When you're doing the measurements for culch, do you just measure the non-live culch? Because obviously the oysters, the live oysters themselves also produce, you know, a substrate that oysters can settle.
So the way the culch is measured, it's the dead culch. It doesn't include the oysters, the live oysters, and it includes only the superficial culch. And in practice, that is determined once you sample the culch, dividing the culch into the black culch and sort of the gray, the white or the gray culch. So anything that's buried does not go into the estimation of culch density. Now, another thing we're looking at is surface area as it relates to culch density. And effective surface area may be a better measure of recruitment potential than mere culch density. Of course, culch density and surface area themselves would be highly correlated, and it's much easier in practice to measure to just simply take the weight of the culch.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Nikki Dix from GTM. I just wondered if you could expand a little bit on what you're doing with the other Gulf states. You said that you're developing criteria for what? I may have missed it.
Okay, so Katie, I'm gonna have you repeat that question.
Yes, Nikki, let me try. There are criteria being developed for other states, Tom, that Nikki was asking about. Is that right, Nikki?
Is it being done for other states?
Are the same criteria being, go ahead.
Yeah, his last slide about the future work with other Gulf states, if you could just expand on that.
Yeah, Katie, repeat that.
Sure. So your last slide where you're working with other state agencies, can you expand a little bit on which states are involved and where that's headed?
Yeah, so all of the Gulf states are involved, and we've done initial simulations on the SK project on all the states, except we haven't finished Alabama yet. And speaking about Florida, we have done some simulations on the culch plants in Florida. And, you know, that's an example where you have a really high culch density, but not really a high density of oysters. And those simulations showed that this year there really wouldn't be much to harvest off of those culch plants. This is in Apalachicola Bay. The oysters are really haven't grown up to a size where they can be harvested in any significant or sustainable amount. So the sustainable fishing for those simulations, for those culch plants in Appalachian Bay were very, very low harvest. I mean, part of it was that there weren't any large oysters on the reef apparently to begin with, and there was some spat setting growth, but they haven't really reached the size of or an abundance for harvestability.
Does that answer your question, Nikki?
I think so. I was just trying to get at what the objective of that project was. I'm not really sure what SK means, but.
What does SK mean, Tom? Can you hear me, Tom?
Oh, yeah.
We're wondering what SK means.
What SE means?
What SK, the project that you're referring to?
Oh, I'm sorry. That's the Saltonstall Kennedy program of NOAA.
Hi, Tom. Is the Appalach Bay area the only area in the Florida Gulf that the model has been run on?
No, we've run the model on Texas. Texas has a really good, extensive data set from all of the bays and in Texas. So we've run the model there. Mississippi did not even do a survey this year. There's so few oysters out there, so there was no simulation for Mississippi. Alabama we're working on now, and Florida, you know, it was only for Apalachicola Bay.
Hey, Tom, this is Steve Durham from FDEP. I have a question for you about, can you comment on any differences in terms of modeling subtidal populations versus intertidal populations? Because obviously a lot of Florida is intertidal.
Yeah, and you know, I should have mentioned this, that this is for subtidal oysters only, and so it isn't intended to apply to intertidal oysters.
This is Laura Gesselbrock. I'm just curious, what do you think might be the differences in the model if you had to adjust it for intertidal?
Yeah, I think, you know, the growth and mortality equations would be different. So, you know, the growth and mortality equations were derived from subtidal oysters in Louisiana. And I think the growth rates and the mortality rates would be different.
Hey, Tom, this is Steve Durham again. I'm also wondering if you could comment on, you know, I know there's been a lot of work done in, you know, with Eric Powell and you and others about shell half-lives and things like that. How does that fit into the budget model, how long the dead shell lasts on the reef?
Yeah, so shell half-life fits into the model because we have parameters for the loss, the annual loss of shell, and it's on the order of about 10% per year for oyster shell. And in our model, we also, there are various types of substrate, for example, limestone, concrete. They have different rates of loss. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I thought maybe I lost the phone connection. Okay. Yeah, so that half-life helps determine the annual natural rate of shell loss. So shell loss is the sum of the natural loss on the order of about 10% plus whatever fishing loss there is.
I see. Okay. So I would expect that would probably be, well, obviously the fishing might be different, but I think perhaps the shell half-lives would be different between subtidal and intertidal as well.
Yeah, that's another good point. I think that could be different. Okay, any more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much, and I'm going to hang on for the other talks and the discussion on shell budget modeling.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm glad everybody could hear, and we are still recording. So we'll move on at this point to Ed Camp with the University of Florida. Ed, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Do you want me to try to share my screen?
Yes, you can. Use the open share tray button in the middle of your screen, and we can.
Let's see how it goes. Do we have some success?
We can see your PowerPoint.
This is fantastic. Okay, very good. I'm aware that lots of you people know lots more about oysters than I do, and some of the people on this call have specifically heard from me before, so I'm going to try to move relatively quickly through the stuff, but we'll have time for discussion if I gloss over something. And please bear with me if I'm telling you something that you already know or that I've already told you. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to insult your intelligence in any way. The first thing I want to do is just run over kind of the way that I think about this. And this is, I suspect, very similar to a lot of the things that Tom said, which is, you know, why should we model oysters in a special way? Why are we concerned about this? So let me flip through a couple slides here. The first of which is we know that oysters are super important, not only as a habitat, providing a bunch of benefits that we call these ecosystem services, like filtering water and actually forming habitat that has these big longshore reefs and is used by a bunch of other little critters and bigger critters. but also is obviously used by the oysters themselves, like Tom's talking about. And this makes them really fascinating to model. Because the young oysters settle and recruit on the living and recently dead oysters, they're actually making their own habitat. They're creating these bars, and these bars actually act to help improve the habitat for oysters. They hem in fresh water, they protect waves, they protect from erosion from waves, and they make things better for oysters, and they also generally make things better for a lot of peoples, which relates to these ecosystem services. But the oysters are considered tasty, and so we harvest them a bunch. And this has been a big part of wild oyster fisheries in Florida, has been harvesting oysters. The challenge here is that we don't just move the oyster, the animal, like we would a finfish. We remove a redfish, we remove a grouper, but we don't remove their habitat when we catch them. But with oysters, we are, because we're taking all these shells out. These are actually pictures from Apalachicola. So despite this, the oyster fisheries have persisted here in Florida and in some other places around the Gulf for a really long time, and they're still, in some places, the lifeblood of these coastal human communities and really important to the relatively few number of people that rely on them. Obviously, things are not well in the Florida oyster world, and I like this slide because it shows that the date is 2012, and not much has changed, except it seems to have gotten worse. And things are not well, really, generally around the world. This is the Beck paper suggesting oysters are declining pretty rapidly, pretty much everywhere. And so the interesting question is why? Why is it that we've been so ineffective at constraining the harvest of this animal that doesn't move, that's relatively easy to see? We've had decent success with some other fisheries, but not really with oysters. And so a couple things to just go over that really relate to the way that I constructed the model. And the first is compensatory recruitment dynamics. And what this refers to is the stock-recruit relationship that we know must exist for pretty much all fisheries to ever have sustainability. And the implication of this curve here is that the survival rate must increase as the adults decrease. So the juvenile survival rate increases as adults decrease. This is called compensatory density-dependent survival. And this is what we think happens for most fish. But really critically, if an animal creates its own habitat, it shouldn't have this nice asymptotic function. We should have a type 3 or a sinusoidal, sigmoidal pattern, not sinusoidal. And basically what this infers is that there's some inflection point below which actually the juvenile survival rate decreases, which is potentially catastrophic because it means that after you go over some threshold, the population should decline towards collapse. And all of this is a more technical way of saying that unlike most animals, but not all, perhaps oysters were not actually evolved to be rare. Okay, so compensatory recruitment dynamics could make collapse possible, but not inevitable. What else about oyster systems could result in this really systematic pattern that these fisheries seem to tend towards collapse absent management intervention? And one of them is simply that most fisheries management, and oyster management is not really different than this, tends to be reactive. And by that I mean that what happens is when there is a problem, we take an action. And this is normally fine. This is what we would want management to do. If management didn't act like this, we would almost certainly see a big loss of economic value and human welfare if it was acting proactively all the time. The challenge is that if you're dealing with something that has this alternative stock-recruit relationship, it's going to have these threshold dynamics where basically you can fall off. So things will look fine for a little bit, and then all of a sudden there's a problem, but you've already gone over this edge. Like what Tom was alluding to with his description of basically, well, you go over this threshold and then it's difficult to get back into a place where we're having enough shell or boxes for the fat to settle on and grow up. So this sort of governance approach, management approach, coupled with the way we assess or inform the management is problematic. And the issue here is that basically fisheries assessments are designed to be retrospective. And what that means is they look backwards and they say, well, what was the harvest removal in the past? And based off that, what should be sustainable moving forward? And that works really well for things that, again, don't have these threshold dynamics, don't have these potential alternative stable states. But when you have these systems, you can look backwards like we've done in Apalachicola and said, well, this level of harvest was sustainable for, literally decades, if not longer. It should be sustainable now. But that is, of course, not accounting for, well, what if we have been systematically reducing the habitat for recruitment? So when you couple these things together, the compensatory recruitment dynamics, reactive management, and retrospective fisheries assessment, it makes it really difficult to avoid a collapse. The only thing that is missing is basically you have to have the price of oysters high enough so that harvest outpaces the shell accumulation, like Tom was talking about. And then it's simply a matter of time and productivity. And basically gear. More effective gears with less productive systems should crash a population sooner. Less productive systems with less efficient gear, or less productive systems and more efficient gear even sooner. And so, you know, you put these things together and basically we're almost impossible to avoid oyster collapses, given their dynamics and the way that we manage the systems, which is somewhat depressing. That's the justification for trying to build some different models, basically improving on those fisheries models, which have been over the years kind of co-opted to, you know, bent and made to represent oysters, but maybe not well enough. And so what I'm going to show now is just the beginnings of some work that I'm doing with FSU and FWC to develop an oyster model to help inform some of the work they're doing up in Apalachicola. And the model is not possible without the really substantial work that FWC's done. Both folks like Melanie Parker, who's moved on from FWR right now, and then Jim Estes and Mike Norberg. These people are providing the data that allows this model to be in any way useful, and without them, like it's just a simulation just in my head, well, and in code. So, all right, what I'm going to tell you about right now is just the model structure. So this is a simulation. It's not fit to the data yet. I'm doing that. The fitting isn't trivial. We can talk about the challenges with that later. The overall structure, this is an age-structured, discrete time, population dynamics, or socio-ecological systems model. What that last little phrase meant is that, yeah, I'm representing the oyster population, but I'm going to link it to human behavior through dynamic fisher utility, basically trying to represent how fishing effort will change as a function of the resource, the oysters, as well as the management. So I'm going at this modeling from a classic fisheries assessment, simulation, management strategy evaluation perspective, which makes it flexible, but there's some key oyster adaptations that, you know, could be done in more detail, but I think are okay for now. Right now it's spatially implicit. It's going to have to be made explicit. We can discuss the challenges therein. Here's the features that are special for oysters. So it assumes recruitment is a function of habitat, and very specifically what I'm doing is I'm modifying the Beverton-Holt recruitment function. So Beverton-Holt is one of the most common stock recruitment functions, and it is implicit or explicit within virtually every stock assessment model. It is not the only stock recruitment function, but they're all assessment models, and fisheries population models will have some recruitment functions. Beverton-Holt is the most common. You can modify it based off work that Carl Walters did in the early 2000s to allow the parameters to shift as a function of the habitat that you think is available for recruitment. So that's the first assumption. And then the second little tweak here is that we can make the habitat available for recruitment as a function of shell, and I said plus restored material. And now the shell is going to be a function of shell dynamics. And so what I've done is sort of mimic the very detailed calculations that Tom and other folks have done to say, well, that oysters that die naturally in the water would produce shell. That shell is lost at some rate, which may be variable with other things. And that shell is going to be used for the recruitment. The other things that this model would have that you would expect, it has natural mortality. Right now it's fixed, but we can make it a function of the environment if we would like it to be. It has fishing mortality, which is right now exacted through fishing effort and catchability. Either one of those things can be changed. Most notably would be fishing effort. So we would have fishing mortality changing as a function of fisher behavior and management actions should management actions constrain effort like they currently have in Apalachicola. And when we parameterize a fisher behavior model. And then what that means is basically saying the fisher behavior will be a function of their anticipated utility or revenue that they would get. And that's what would make it a socio-ecological model where you have the feedbacks between the people harvesting and the actual resources. So the output, what I'm going to show you now is basic stuff, oyster populations, recruitment, and shell, but you can also look at fishery harvest and value and fishing effort. And then from that, you can derive economic value. And when you work with some economists, which I am, you can turn that into economic contribution and impact. The economic value here is a lot easier than if I was doing a recreational fishery, because we're just basically looking at the X vessel landings price, which is the standard in these approaches. So again, I'm going to focus right now just on this first stuff about oysters, population, recruitment, and shell. And you get to see my really crummy Microsoft Paint illustrations of an oyster life cycle. And so this would be a too simple one, but this is what I've done this before. I've done this like years ago when I started modeling oysters. We say, okay, well, there's eggs, and then they turn into recruits, and then they turn into harvestable adults, which obviously is missing something. But let me just show you what this does when you put it, this life cycle, when you put it in populations. So here's a basic model of this where we're assuming oysters function the same way that fish are. So you have eggs, harvestable adults, and recruits without fishing. And you see nice flat lines. That's what we should see. And then we say, hey, we're going to clobber the fishery. And what will happen? Well, we're going to greatly reduce the harvestable adults because we harvested them, which will decrease the amount of eggs. And it decreases the amount of recruits some, but because of density-dependent mortality, you see less than proportional decrease in recruits relative to that of harvestable adults. This is all as we would expect, basic fisheries population dynamics. And again, I'm not telling you this because I think you don't know it. It's helpful to see it. I know that many of you know this better than me. And so if you have that simple situation and then you say, hey, let's constrain fishing effort a little bit. That's what this red dotted line is. You have bounce backs in the recruits, in the harvestable adults, and the eggs in the system. That's what we would expect. Here we have added a further fantastic illustration done in Microsoft Paint, and that is shell. We're going to pretend that this is shell. And so here we're saying, okay, there's eggs, but they have to settle on shell to be able to get through that density-dependent mortality period and become recruits, turn into harvestable adults, and make more eggs. And so we start with our same system where we have no fishing, and that is as expected. But this is what happens if you put in fishing. At first, you see decreases just the same way we did with the other assumption, the assumption that you don't have this shell dynamics in there. See a population decline in recruits, decline in shell. But then what you see next is what happens when you're pushing over that threshold. You're saying, okay, for a period of years, it actually looked just like any other system. Everything was sustainable, everything was fine. There's been no increase in effort between years 15 and 20 here where you see the second fall off. It's just been that we basically burned through the shell that was suitable for recruitment, and now we're in a crummy, bad place. And the problem with this place is it's really hard to get out of it. So you can reduce fishing effort, but because there's so little habitat there, we don't get much of a bounce back at all in terms of harvestable adults or recruits. This is called the fold catastrophe, or alternative stable states, as ecologists are wont to describe it. And so we can add in restoration here, and what you see is, I think, something that Tom and other folks have alluded to, which is that if you only restore a little bit, or if you haven't constrained effort enough, you can see a jump up after restoration. So we put in a bunch of shell here, but what happened was actually there wasn't enough eggs to colonize the shell to turn into recruits to get us back over the hump, and so it sort of fell back down, and that's really depressing. So what you get when you have these shell dynamics, the result of that is you can have really tippy systems where you can do a bunch of restoration, but if it's not enough, or if it's not coupled with protecting the animals that are there from harvest for long enough, you actually can manage to really not make it over the hump. You cannot jump yourself back up into that high productivity system. And this is an alternative one where we basically restored more and kept the fishery closed for longer, and then you see it bounce back up to a much higher level that can sustain some fishing after the fact. And so again, like, this is not earth-shattering. It's fun for me to be able to construct something that, let's see if I can share something different. It's fun for me to construct something that can play around with this stuff. So it didn't follow me. It's still showing you a PowerPoint, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can share a different screen. Okay. So a little piece of code. And what it lets you do is change all of the different things that we talked about in that model. So you can change the fishing effort, how you think the habitat relates to shell. You can change the time and when you start fishing and restoration. I'm just showing you that it just is a little tiny piece of code, and you can turn it like turning knobs on a stereo, which I guess none of us have stereos anymore. And then you can, you can run them and they will turn into what? Anyway, so the point is this is put in, it looks like a big, long, complicated model, but it's not. It's actually pretty small and short and compact, and it runs really quickly, and you can turn and change all of the assumptions that we made, and you get different answers. And so the purpose of this, as I go back to find my PowerPoint, Katie, this is still working. Like you're still seeing what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about screens that aren't there.
Nope, we can see. You're doing good.
Okay, sweet. All right, so model's not complete. Lots of stuff is missing. It has to be fit to data. I talked about that already. Once we fit it at a bay-wide scale, we'll downscale it to some specific bars, and then fine-tune for some management actions, meaning that we have to put in some different knobs to be able to say, okay, well, what if we're going to do some specific actions with returning shells to the bay, or some specific spatial closures, or are we going to change who can go fishing? Any of those things have to be put in. And then finally will be the economic outputs to turn it into value, and potentially other ecosystem services. So the applications for this is it can be used absent data just as is. You can plug in guesses if you want to explore management strategy evaluations. Lots of people do this. I do this a lot. It puts a lot of pressure on the model operator to not do something stupid if you're going to just run a simulation without fitting it well to data. So that's like what keeps me up at night, to make sure that I didn't cook the books too much, to make sure that we're actually getting useful information out of it. But you can do that to explore different management strategies, saying, well, if oysters function in this way, here's what we should do. And what if we're wrong about how oysters function? Would our answer about what the best option is be any different? Those are the types of things you can do right now with it as it is. If there's different places where we have decent data, you can obviously fit it to that, and that is turning it into a stock assessment. Right now, we are turning it into stakeholder tools. So because it's done in Program R, which is open and free and all that stuff, it's pretty easy to turn it into a Shiny app. So I'm working on that with some students. And the whole thing will be demoed in Apalachicola Bay, fingers crossed, should everything go through and UF and FWC handle the grant side of it without getting in squabbles over it. I would like it to work in Apalachicola Bay and Swanee Sound, and it should. That is our plan. So we'll get to see the model, and we'll get to poke holes in it and change things that people don't like about it. And so then just kind of the sum up of this, because I'm aware that not everybody spends a lot of time thinking about models, is this is just one model. There's lots of different ways that you can model oysters. This one is relatively general. It lacks a lot of the really nice detail that more specific models, like I think what Thomas produced, has a lot more detail about the way that shell accretes and dissolves, basically. But this model is flexible. It's applicable. It's not perfect. Hopefully it will be useful. Present form is really to do what-if analysis, management strategy evaluation. To make it more believable, we have to make sure that the scaling of the model lines up with reality, and that is done through fitting it. That turns it into stock assessment approaches. And again, the most important thing is this is one of many viable approaches to modeling oysters. I don't think that it is necessarily the best one. It's the one that I'm using now. And the main step forward with this is, I guess, taking a pretty standard fisheries population dynamic approach that can be turned into these other things like the stock assessments and the management strategy tools, but trying to make sure that we're representing the key dynamics about oysters, which is especially how they create their own habitat. So I will take any questions and concerns as there is time, Katie.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, we definitely have time for questions.
I'm just going to leave the PowerPoint up for now so my screen can stay shared. But this means you don't get to see me as much, I think.
We actually can't see your, you're not sharing your slides right now.
Oh no, really? Like,
after the code.
That was disappointing.
I
Hold
see
on.
your PowerPoint.
Wait,
saw.
I can see the PowerPoint
Yeah,
too.
we saw the PowerPoint.
Oh, sorry, this is Chris Kaufman. I only see Ed.
Oh, fascinating.
Oh, click on the box that has in the lower right.
Thank
That's
you.
that's
Sorry
up to
about that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hey, Ed, this is Steve Geiger.
Hey, Steve.
When you talk about actually fitting it to a place like Apalachicola Bay or Suwannee, I would assume part of the big unknown for all of us is, how much shell is critical to allow whatever spatter in the system to settle and accrete and eventually grow the reef.
Yep.
Do you have a concept for if you modeled an individual reef, and then B, if you had a network of reefs that have some level of communication that we don't know? I assume that's where you're going, but I wonder if you could comment on that.
This is one of the biggest uncertainties that I have is if we assume, if we go all the way back to these kind of key assumptions here, if we assume that recruitment is a function of habitat, fine with that, but then habitat for recruitment is a function of shell. This second one, this one is the really critical one. I think that's what you're getting at. And this is really hard to inform empirically from the past data because we don't have fantastic measurements over time of things like the reef height or the total amount of shell on reefs. If we had something as simple as how high were the reefs in Apalachicola for like the last 30 years, like I would pay so much for that information. It would be really, really fantastic. So what we're left with is a couple things. We can try to basically make a list of the alternative shapes of the relationships between habitat and shell. And so I want you to imagine in your mind, I guess I should have put this in here, but just imagine, okay, if habitat for recruitment scales linearly with the amount of shell. So basically more habitat for recruitment. The challenge with that would be that you would have no natural resilience of oysters. As you start to lose some shell from harvesting, you've lost habitat for recruitment, which means less shell, and it cycles down. So basically, there's only so many different functional relationships you can have, and a couple of them really don't work. If there's no functional relationship, you're stuck back at fish. Like the oyster is now a fin fish. It's probably not that. If it's linear, there would be no natural resilience to the reefs at all, so they probably wouldn't exist. So that's where I've arrived at this threshold point that you saw, but it could also be which would be a type 3 functional response. It could also be a type 2 functional response, which would be an asymptotic function. In terms of empirically how to suss those apart, probably our best bet now is going to be actual empirical experimentation, which is, I think, getting to your question of saying, like, if we try to understand how is recruitment going to change as a function of the amount of shell there, we may need to experimentally vary, basically build mini reefs at different heights and see how that changes. There's a lot of other nasty uncertainties with that. So for example, how is that relationship between habitat suitable for recruitment and the amount of shell going to be mediated by environmental conditions like salinity or temperature? So there's slop in here that I don't think we're going to be able to fantastically pull apart. What we're going to do in Apalachicola is we are going to make a couple alternative assumptions about these key uncertainties, and we're going to run our alternative assumptions through all the data and run the management strategies across all these alternative assumptions. And hopefully what we'll see is that regardless of these specific assumptions, there will emerge some things that are more consistently the better options to do. And what is critical here is that my feelings aren't hurt if this model can't sort it out. But what I want the model to do is provide us reasonable management advice. Where we'll be in a bad place is if the different versions of the model making alternative assumptions about these ecological relationships that we haven't sorted yet, if they each yield different suggestions about the best course of management actions, then we're going to be in an uncomfortable place, because now we're going to have to decide, well, which version of ecological reality do we trust the most? And that will suck, but that might happen. So I'm working with the FSU folks to help guide some of their experimental work to try to get a little bit of information out of this, and we'll be paying close attention to the other literature that comes out. So there's been a series of papers in the last 10 years or so talking about these relationships between, say, reef height and recruitment survival, but not enough that we can with certainty say, you know, here's what that relationship should be. So I'm sorry for such a lengthy answer to that question, but it was a super important question, and it exposes one of the key weaknesses in doing this, which is we haven't empirically developed that recruitment relationship. The only thing to take solace in is we actually haven't developed the empirical recruitment relationships for an awful lot of fish. Like, we basically have some theory, and we've done 50 plus years of stocks assessment and management on mostly what Beverton and Holt did like 70 years ago. So it hasn't stopped us from doing some things and sometimes managing things well. But it would be really helpful if we could get some more empirical work here, and also for monitoring moving forward. It would be really great to get things like reef height and total amounts of shell out there.
So I'm going to interrupt you there. I think, Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to chime in on this relationship between oyster abundance and recruit. So through this project, we've developed a relationship between estimated surface area and recruits. And then I think that'll be very useful. Now, for us, it's useful because we can get an idea of, you know, what a reasonable amount of surface area is, or culch density is. And of course, this relationship follows, you know, it's a diminishing returns with the amount of surface area and recruits. And if there is a reasonable abundance of larvae in the water, and this is probably the case in most systems, even with fairly low population of oysters, then the limiting factor may be the surface area of the effective surface area of the reef as it relates to recruits. And so this relationship was developed from Delaware Bay in a 65-year time series, and it's a part of what we're working on with the Salt Kennedy program, and we've developed a publication that'll be out soon in Journal of Shellfish Research, which shows this relationship between estimated surface area of reef and recruits.
Cool. Well, I'll look forward to reading that.
Yeah, and I think it would be real useful to you. But I'll wait and see if anybody has any more questions before we get into a general discussion.
Sure. And Tom, I think that my gut is that what you've said is probably what we'll wind up doing. I tried to make the functional relationships here such that they would basically represent how would the surface area of a reef change with decreasing reef height. And you can imagine sort of that would not change an awful lot as the reef gets a little bit shorter until the reef gets so short that the surface really falls apart. So I would be really excited to talk more about that and to try to have a more empirical backing for what we've put in here now.
Yeah.
I think Ryan Gandy, did you also have your hand up?
Yeah, yes, I do. Hi, this is Ryan. I'm actually taking over for Melanie in this regard, I just had, I think it's a shorter term concern given that, and I think it relates into what Tom was talking about surface area, given that, you know, we really have a hugely depleted shell resource up in Appalachia. So I think it's something that over time, as we rebuild that, those bars and that sort of thing, where your model may come to, you know, in the short term, I think relating to management strategies might miss, given that, you know, we've got a depleted resource until we get enough shell on the bottom out there to where that model is now looking at actual, it's more along the lines of what a recovered resource would be, or at least the potential for a recovered resource would be. So I hope at some point, you know, we can get together offline and talk about some of our monitoring again, and catch up with that as far as any other additional things you might think might be useful for the things you're trying to model that we could try to capture.
Absolutely. Like, that would be fantastic to do. And like I said, the model hasn't been fit yet. We'll be able to get some better information as I work through some of the data that Mel so generously shared with us, and through some of the fisheries dependent data too. The one thing that I do want to point out is that right now, what we're actually seeing, even with the simulation model, I think does represent a lot of what you're talking about, which is in this scenario that I think most of you can see now, where you do some pretty heavy reshelling and it's just a blip and then it goes away. What's driving that? You know, and when I put this up and showed it to folks in the Apalachicola meeting, one of the people who's been an oysterman for a long time said, well, you know, we think the problem now is that we have so little substrate, or maybe we don't even have enough larvae or spat that there's not enough for them to get going. That's what we're seeing here. The reason you see this spike and then it goes back down is that basically there wasn't enough spat to form a good enough recruitment to get enough shells. So most of the shell that's put into the system is actually basically dissolving away or becoming not useful for recruitment before it's colonized and jumpstarting that cycle again. So what's neat about it is that even with the simple simulation model, we see these pretty nasty and tippy system dynamics. What's not neat about it is it means that it actually, you could spend a bunch of money putting more shell in and not get the system back to where you think it could be if you just restore, say, all the bars, you know, 25% below the threshold that they should. I'm not going to make management recommendations based off this yet, because that would be stupid. But what it tells me is that we will want to err on the side of restoring bars with more durable material and higher than we think we may need them, lest we risk making a mistake and doing it too little and not having any results. So our risk should be really asymmetrical here, and we can lean on the decision science approaches for how to handle potential asymmetrical risk.
Yeah, no, I like that and I agree with that. And I think working with you guys to find where that critical mass, because that's really what we have to get back to. Yeah. It's just a critical mass of material so that, you know, the spatial and temporal changes in salinity or predators or whatever, at least gives you chances to have bars that are productive in different scenarios. And I think that's going to be our big challenge over time, because you're right, we could dump a ton of shell, but if it's not in diverse locations, we don't get that resiliency bump, and you might not even see it. So I think as we go down the road, it'll be interesting to see how our shell strategy and some of this emerging findings is going. So looking forward to it.
For sure. And one last thing I'll point out on there, I didn't show it as clearly here, but the model was really sensitive to how long you left the fishery shut down for after restoration. And basically the point of saying that is that it won't just be how much shell we put in, but it will be how we manage the fishery related to that. And so you can run the simulation, and what it can tell you is, well, if you put in a ton of shell, it'll be fine. But if you put in, you know, a more moderate amount of shell, but you don't leave the fishery closed for long enough, it'll be all for naught. So there'll be a couple of pretty tricky knobs that we'll have to get right, I think, especially considering that it's entirely ecologically possible that what that, you mentioned it, what that biomass or what that mass is may change based off these environmental conditions. So yeah, I'm a little bit intimidated by the uncertainty here, but I think it will be useful.
Yeah, but it's good to have that fishery component early on, because I think it'll help our managers with where we're going with the current closure. So Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
So Kent, I see your hand, but Michael Norberg, you also had your hand up. Did you get your question or comment addressed?
Yeah, that follow-up conversation about density dependence and equilibrium and stuff like that was really helpful. So I'm good.
Go ahead, Kent.
Yeah, Ed, this is great. I think, and I really appreciate the comments that Ryan provided on this too. I think from a management perspective, this lends a lot of credence to, as you pointed out, spacing our reef restoration efforts out, in a given system, and using kind of diverse approaches. Because if you're talking about, not having sufficient spat and material, we can still build up the material, but you're still going to need to make sure that you ensure over time that you're going to have the spat necessary to maintain that, the resulting shell budget of a viable population. And I think that gets back, Michael, I don't know if you saw this in here, but, it gets back to this concept of, in terms of like what we're trying to do with our stakeholder planning over for an oyster management plan in Pensacola and places like Apalachicola, I think we really need to start considering seriously doing, I don't know if you want to call them like spat reserves or something, where we're going to have spaced oyster reefs out that actually can supply those over time as well, once we restore them.
So quick follow-up to that, Kent, and really everybody. So it seemed like there was a lot of evidence that Apalachicola Bay, up until recently, there wasn't a spat limitation. But yet we continued to see adult abundance declining every year. So I think that kind of, if that's true, if spat really wasn't limited despite a declining adult abundance, I think that's an important thing to try to consider when it comes to restoration of certain systems. Is in this situation right here with what's up on the slide is it's also considering that there is a spat limitation. Your eggs and your recruits are either instability of no density, density independent functions or equilibrium. So I think that's a big thing to take into consideration. I think it'd be interesting to hear from Ryan or any of those other folks that have done some work on whether that spat limitation actually has been an issue for longer than we anticipated.
This is John Brucker with the Central Panhandle. A lot of the work we've done in Appalach, it's only been for a couple years so far. The fact that we have seen less and less spat and more harvesting pressure or a lack of reduction of harvesting pressure. A lot of the reefs where we've dumped a lot of material on, just as it's been suggested, just because the material's there just hasn't been the spat to settle on it to establish itself. So like just the simplicity of this model up here really kind of demonstrates a lot of what we've seen just with our data in the past couple of years in Apalachicola Bay. And some of the other bays we monitor, though, we've seen some of the growth, on our material. And most of that is because those areas, they close those areas to the harvesting. And so that's a major component. And I think that'll really be a part in the management strategy moving forward, as we've decided in the 5-year closure. But it may be that it needs to be longer than that. That's a big question that needs to be raised as well, is how long is enough? How do we decide how long is enough? So that's the kind of where I'd like to see the model going, is how do we find out, how do we determine how long is enough to make it sustainable?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think part, with Ed's work involved in this larger project that's going on, incorporating that socioeconomic perspective is going to be quite interesting, because oftentimes between the biology and the social perspective, those are conflicting interests. So I think that'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Yep. One of the things that we will two things. One that we'll have to struggle with this is that some of the stuff that I presented here will seem really counterintuitive, because I think a lot of folks who know more than me about Apalachicola Bay, like the oyster folks, the oyster harvesters, they've seen it be really productive under really high harvest regimes. And I think it will be a challenge to help them consider the possibility that that actually could have been sustainable in the very short term, while in the long term it was sort of just literally eroding the shell underneath their feet. But in fisheries, we've seen a big issue with, if what a model predicts doesn't line up with somewhat what someone has seen or lived, it can cause people to not believe the models, and then they're not really useful. They live on computers, they don't do anything for us. So we're gonna have to work a lot with them to try to get some faith in the model. The other thing that I just remembered that I should have pointed out earlier is we will put spatial dispersal dynamics in this. It's another level of complexity that we won't be able to do in every different system, but that will allow us to explore, for example, well, even with some uncertainty about how oyster larvae disperse, what is the spatial arrangement that you would want to employ to try to make sure that you have good results. So for example, what we do, what Ray Grizzle has suggested in his recent publications in terms of just starting with one reef and moving out in a pattern from that to make sure that there are good spat sources for the new reefs that are constructed. But that part won't all be dependent on me. I'll be working with some people who are good at the hydrodynamic modeling, and they will help quite a bit with that.
Ken, do you have another question?
Yeah, actually, just a comment, I think, to add to. I think, the more we can kind of refine what we're seeing in a given system, and with more information, the less risk of failure we'll have in terms of successful restoration. So I understand the complexities and everything, and most of this is going to be kind of risk management relative to how management implements, resource management basically implements the recoveries we're looking at. But it's good to be able to see these models moving forward, so that we can actually we can present these to those regional stakeholder working groups. We can work the economics out, both in terms of what it's going to cost to restore and what the productivity of the system will be over time, and kind of what our success efforts have to look like to be able to achieve all this and manage that level of risk. So just an observation. I really don't have a question there.
Very good. I agree.
Ed, this is Steve Geiger again. I'm gonna not try to put Matt Davis on the hot spot, but my understanding from the data is that there is actually differences in settlement between the difference of regions, the open and closed areas, east and west. To me, that's kind of indicative of, well, there could be environmental causes, obviously, but that there is some limitation. There's not an infinite amount of spat. I mean, does that fit with what you're kind of describing, or?
That is the inference that I would draw as well, Steve. Obviously, it could be currents or something like that. But yeah, if you're seeing real differences in settlement between your open and your closed areas, that would be suggestive of that. However, I guess I would point out that we should expect to see initial. So here's where I think it becomes tricky. Like, the term recruitment and settlement sometimes get used interchangeably, and I know you're not using it interchangeably here, but it is a difference. So when I'm saying settlement, I'm talking about the larvae settling down and attaching. And we might expect that to be more linearly related to the total amount of spat in the water, which we would expect to be very related to whether an area is open or closed. When I'm talking about the recruits or the recruitment here, I'm talking about basically the oysters that made it past roughly 3/4 or an inch long. That's the ones that we think they're past that worst density dependent mortality, and they've escaped some of the most intense predation.
Right.
So if, it wouldn't be shocking to see different settlement rates between open and closed areas. And it still wouldn't necessarily mean that we had a, you know, we're calling it spat limited, but what we really mean is a recruitment issue where the recruitment is limited to the amount of spat. But if we start to see, okay, this open area has virtually no oysters over an inch, they settle and then they die, whereas the closed area is having, you know, settlement and then actually more of them are living, that would be sort of the real indication of it. There are some challenges with that. We're not 100% sure exactly how density dependent mortality should work for animals like oysters. I've explored it a lot for other different animals, and we usually think that somewhere around 15 to 20% of the total length is a decent cutoff to say, okay, this should be through most of the density dependent mortality now. But that's certainly not carved in stone, written in stone, whatever. It's not permanent. We don't actually know that. And so we will explore some alternative assumptions with that and hope to inform it as best as we can from both the data as well as from any experimental work that comes out of it.
Yeah, and just if I can chime in, this is Ryan again. And I think that's where a lot of our models, you know, it's that resolution. And, you know, when we're modeling crabs, we're modeling shrimp or anything else, you know, it may be the model isn't able to capture open versus closed, but because Apalachicola is such a small region, and that you look at the bay as an overall bay system of that, it might be able to capture the health of the bay system, which takes into account different bars. So you kind of bring it all together versus the tight resolution of a open versus a closed area, given all the dynamics involved and uncertainties involved. So, you know, I think that'll be interesting to see how the model plays out resolution wise, and that will go to how do you sell this in a way to the commercial fishermen that it's explaining what they're seeing. Do you explain it on a region-wide basis, a bay-wide basis, or a bar-to-bar basis? So I think those are going to be some critical, interesting things.
Yep, for sure. Right now, the plan is to fit it at the bay-wide basis. And the reason we have to do that is we have to get some of the scale parameters right so that it lines up and is actually predicting the observations in terms of the harvest and perhaps even fisheries independent data. And then if we can get that, then we will have to basically wait by the bar areas to try to make predictions about what's going to happen with the specific bars. But you know what I just said is basically we're going to fit the model at the bay area, and once we fit it, we'll try to downscale it and run the forward simulations, these management strategy evaluations at finer scales if we have to. Understanding, yeah, there may be some uncertainty there, but I don't think that there's another way to do it right now.
Yeah, and I think where the tire meets the road is that if as a bay-wide management tool, and then the individuals really come off of some of that more direct monitoring that goes on, it's more real time, given the lag in model runs and all that. You know, we see that with annual crops, and that we never can catch up with the model and management recommendations on a real time, but we end up modeling over periods of, say, a generation or two generations of shrimp or what have you.
Right.
So.
Okay. Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
So Ed, this is Katie. Just kind of looking ahead, what is your timeline, or what do you anticipate in terms of sharing this information with stakeholders in the Apalachicola region, or developing the model further? Would you like to follow up with this group at some point on your progress?
Yeah, sure. Within 2 months, I need to have it fit to the bay, at least an initial fitting, and we'll probably in a couple of months have some more fine scale adjustments on the recruitment function. Maybe after talking with Tom, maybe after talking with some others, we'll try to fix that up. I can check back in whenever people want, and it can be a lot shorter than this. In terms of being able to share it, the purpose of this is to be useful. So if there's people who want versions of this now, I can hand you code if that's something that you want to play around with. Happy to collaborate on that stuff. Right now, like I said, the model is spatially implicit, which means that someone could use it for something as small as a single reef or for as large as a whole estuary or larger population. But probably within, I would say, 4 months, we'll have the mobile shiny versions of it up, so people will be able to play around with it more. I guess to answer your question, Katie, maybe not the next meeting, but the meeting after. If there's interest, I can give a brief update on it, but it doesn't have to be a presentation. And also, I think most people here have my contact information, so they're always welcome to just bug me about it if they have questions in between now and then too.
Sure. We have a couple more minutes. Does anybody have any other questions or for the presenters or general discussion? Any other actions the group might want to set forward?
Yeah, I have something to add. This is Tom. Can you hear me, Kay?
Can everybody hear Tom?
Yeah, so, I know everybody realizes this, but it probably bears repeating, and that, of course, everything is driven by recruitment. I mean, without recruitment, the whole system deteriorates. There's only one trajectory, and that's natural culture loss will result in the deterioration of the reef. I mean, I think everybody realizes that. So there needs to, of course, be recruitment to the reef and then recruitment to the fishery. I mean, the way this works is you have to grow enough oysters to a large size to die in place to resupply the reef. Now, I think one practical management approach is that manage such that all reefs are sinks and sources of spat. And I think that could be done by criteria that we're of how many oysters per square meter should be retained on the reef, what the effective surface area or the culture density would be. If and when we have standards for that, then all reefs could be managed as sinks and sources of spat. And I know this sounds like maybe a great claim, but I think we're pretty much close to solving this as a biological problem, at least theoretically, in the sense that we can model and say how much oysters can be taken from a reef and keeping the reef without a loss of culture and keeping the reef sustainable. The whole key is getting recruitment and oysters to grow to adult size and not overfishing so that you have oysters to resupply the reef. I mean, I think the real problems are in the social and political realm. I was really shocked when we developed this in Louisiana that there was some of the more vocal and powerful oyster growers opposition to this. I mean, surely you would think that a model that would be developed that could tell the industry what can be sustainably fished would be welcome, and also that it would also be a way of the industry and NGOs to work together to have fishable reefs and sustainable reefs and ecologically significant reefs. But there's been real pushback in Louisiana from some of the more powerful oystermen who don't want to hear anything about overfishing. If this work would have been done in the year 2000, it might have been more accepted, but there would have been no interest in doing it because oysters were so abundant. Running these simulations on populations of oysters that we had in the year 2000 would mean that the oystermen could get all the oysters they want to supply the market and the reefs would still be growing. So in areas in times of great abundance, the reefs can be sustainably fished and supply the market. But we're not there now. We're at a time of greatly diminished abundance, and there are many oystermen that do not want any suggestion that the reefs are overfished. And in fact, some of them claim that the industry is self-regulating because, according to them, they will stop fishing when there aren't enough oysters. Well, we know this not to be the case, but that argument is still being made. And so I think the real issue lies in the social and political realm. And I think we have a pretty good understanding of the biology of the situation. Thank you.
Hey, this is Nikki. I just wanted to add on to that. I think that's a great point. And I'm sitting here thinking that there are opportunities in other places that aren't depleted yet, like our reefs in Northeast Florida. And we have good engagement with oyster people and whatnot. So just to kind of keep that in mind statewide, like maybe take advantage of this modeling approach and stakeholder engagement approach, and maybe try to apply it in other areas where the reefs are not decimated yet.
Oh.
Hey, Nikki, this is Mike. So you had a really great comment, and I think it's valuable to let the whole group know. So right now, marine fisheries management and a few other folks within the agency and outside the agency are looking at statewide management opportunities and opportunities to find funding to actually make that more effective. So I think, with all the conversations we've had between the FORS group and all of these little subgroups that have split off of it, and stakeholder groups that have developed, through other projects, there's been a lot of progress made and more of a statewide concept. A lot of the focus has been on Appalachia for decades. So I think there's a lot of things to look forward to.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Mike. This is Katie. Has a lot of the stakeholder discussions that have maybe been estuary specific, are you thinking that's going to snowball to a larger scale statewide discussion led by FWC, or can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so if anybody had the opportunity to listen into the oyster discussion presentation at the commission meeting, we had a stakeholder, former FWC employee, call in and discuss the need for more of a statewide approach or more statewide coverage. Oysters were an important resource, and potentially moving into clam management restoration opportunities. But so, shellfish are an important resource, in the Indian River, up in Canaveral, Jacksonville, stuff like that. So that discussion from our commission meeting between the commissioners and some of the public feedback that we had received has really kind of started to set anchor and move towards a statewide approach, statewide thought process at least.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I've lost my connection with Tom, but we're right at 10:45. Let's go ahead. Thanks to you, Ed, and thanks to Tom. I'll be sure to thank him offline for sharing your work and everybody contributing to this discussion. Let's go ahead and take a break until about 11 o'clock. We'll come back together and dig into some subcommittee progress updates. So we'll meet back here at 11 o'clock.
Great.
Sounds good, Katie. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.